Johnny Carson wasn't just the king of late night. He was a quiet assassin with a desk and a smirk. From Hollywood egos to political powder kegs, his stage became a battlefield. These aren't interviews, they're showdowns. What happens when charm fails, and Carson turns the heat all the way up? Late Night Lightning. It started like any other night. An A-list guest, a smiling Carson, and an audience ready for laughs. But just minutes into the segment, the air shifted. The banter was crisp, playful. Then, without warning, Johnny dropped a question that cut right to the core. No setup. No sugarcoat. Just a sharp, unexpected pivot. Do you really believe that? Or is that just good PR? The guest blinked, smiled, shifted in their seat, then fired back, visibly rattled. "Are you trying to start something?" they asked with a half-laugh that didn't quite hide the sting. Carson, cool as ever, leaned back and said, "You tell me." The audience didn't know whether to laugh or hold their breath, and that was Carson's magic. He knew how to dance on the edge of discomfort, right where the truth lived. What made this clash unforgettable wasn't just the tension. It was Carson's lightning-fast reflexes. As the guest doubled down, Johnny pivoted the tone, reframing the moment into comedy without losing the weight of the confrontation. He was a master at making people say what they didn't plan to, and doing it with a smirk. The camera caught everything. The glint in Johnny's eye, the guest's forced grin cracking, the live audience frozen for just a second longer than usual. One woman in the front row audibly gasped. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't planned. It was real. The clash ended not with a handshake, but with silence. A subtle shift in posture. A look. And then Johnny's signature, "We'll be right back." But even after the break, the energy didn't reset, because the viewers had seen something raw, something human. Clips of that exchange lived on for years, played on retrospectives, late-night history specials, and YouTube compilations titled "When Guests Got Too Real." It became the kind of moment that reminded audiences why Johnny Carson wasn't just a host. He was a mirror. And sometimes, that mirror cracked. But Carson never flinched. That's what made it legendary. Which brings us to the next time the stakes were even higher, when politics took center stage, and the jokes cut deeper than comedy. Political tensions unleashed. The chair across from Carson wasn't filled by an actor or a pop star this time. It was a well-known politician with a polished smile and a rigid playbook. But those playbooks didn't work on Johnny. The segment began with formalities, but Johnny was already laying verbal traps. He nodded politely, asked leading questions, then leaned in with something impossible to sidestep. "You said last year this war couldn't be won. So what changed? Your opinion or the facts?" There was a pause. The politician smiled tightly. "Well, Johnny, it's more complicated than that." But Carson didn't blink. He followed with another line, even drier than before. "Usually when it's complicated, someone's not telling the truth." The audience let out a slow, sharp murmur. The politician tried to steer back to his talking points, but the unraveling had already begun. Carson wasn't yelling or accusing. He was using deadpan curiosity as a weapon. With each soft-spoken observation, he stripped away rehearsed answers like peeling wallpaper. And what lay beneath wasn't always pretty. Behind the cameras, the NBC censors were visibly uneasy. This wasn't the usual safe, soft interview. This was late night as public theater. Carson knew the exact temperature of the room and kept it 1 degree hotter than comfort. As the segment ended, Carson thanked the guest. But it didn't feel like gratitude. It felt like closure. The guest left to scattered applause, and Johnny didn't look back. The next morning, headlines screamed, "Carson grills senator on live TV," and "Johnny calls out flip-flop." That clip became a political flashpoint, shared in college courses, newsrooms, and campaign trail documentaries. Carson never claimed to be a political commentator, but in that chair, he became a truth filter no spin doctor could tame. And this wasn't an isolated incident. As politics continued to bleed into entertainment, Carson reminded the world that soft lighting and studio laughter didn't make the questions any less sharp. It just made the answers harder to fake. And just when you thought nothing could rattle Hollywood royalty either, Carson went head-to-head with an ego bigger than the set itself. Up next, when a movie star learned that charisma doesn't work on Johnny Carson. Celebrity Ego Showdown. Some stars walked onto the Tonight Show set expecting to be worshipped. After all, they'd conquered the box office, graced the magazine covers, and believed their own hype. But Johnny Carson never bowed to ego. And when a particularly self-important celebrity tried to dominate the stage, they were met with something they weren't ready for: silence. Then, the kind of line only Johnny could deliver. The guest was all smiles, loud, fast-talking, clearly expecting the usual flattery. They launched into a story about their recent hit movie, pausing for applause that didn't quite come. Carson watched, his posture relaxed, fingers steepled, eyes gleaming. And when the star claimed they were the most versatile actor of their generation, Carson waited a beat, then said with a half-smile, "That must be exhausting." The audience erupted, but the guest didn't laugh. It wasn't that Johnny wanted to humiliate anyone. It was that he had a sixth sense for detecting when someone believed they were above the room. That night, the temperature dropped. You could see it. Tightened jaws, blinking eyes, the performer suddenly unsure of the script. Carson didn't insult them. He didn't have to. He simply turned the mirror back on them, and the reflection wasn't flattering. There's a famous saying in showbiz, "Don't believe your own press." That night, it was as if Carson personally wrote it on cue cards. He kept the conversation moving, but each question had an edge. Subtle jabs disguised as curiosity. The star tried to reset, to flash their charm, but the damage was done. Their mask had slipped. When the segment ended, the applause was polite. Nothing more. Backstage, according to insiders, the celebrity stormed off, frustrated, embarrassed, blaming the audience, the writing, even the lighting. But the truth was clear. Carson had outclassed them without ever raising his voice. The next morning, critics wrote not about the guest's movie, but about Johnny's quiet dismantling of Hollywood arrogance. One paper called it a live-action lesson in grace versus grandeur, and it wouldn't be the last time Carson would gently puncture an overinflated ego. Because while some moments were subtle, others exploded in real time, especially when a joke fell flat, and the guest didn't play along. That takes us straight into the next unforgettable moment, when a gag backfired and Johnny Carson turned tension into television gold. Gag gone wrong. There are moments in live television when everything freezes. Not because of technical issues, but because something is happening that no one in the room knows how to handle. That's exactly what happened the night Johnny Carson delivered a planned joke, only to watch it crash and burn in front of millions. The bit was simple. The setup had been rehearsed. The writers were confident, Johnny was ready, and the audience was primed. The guest, a serious-minded actor known for intense roles, was told there'd be a little comedy during the segment, But what no one expected was how deeply offended the guest would be by the punchline. The moment the joke landed, it was like someone had cut the audio in the studio. Dead silence. The guest turned slowly to Carson and said, flatly, "Why am I a part of this?" You could hear a pin drop. Johnny didn't flinch. He let the pause breathe, looked out at the crowd, then turned back and said coolly, "I was wondering the same thing." And just like that, the tension snapped. The audience burst into nervous laughter. The guest forced a smile, but the damage was done. What followed was 4 of the most uncomfortable minutes ever aired on The Tonight Show. Carson tried to move on, shift gears, and salvage the energy, but the guest refused to play. Their body language shut down, answers got shorter, and the chemistry was gone. Carson, always the pro, kept the rhythm. But behind the scenes, producers were panicking. It was one of those moments where live TV becomes high-wire drama. There was no editing, no redo, and Carson, he lived for it. "This is what happens when the truth shows up in a tux," he once joked the following night, referring to the guest's awkwardly formal outfit and even more awkward attitude. The next day, viewers were divided. Some blamed Carson for pushing too far. Others praised him for keeping his cool. But everyone agreed on one thing: they couldn't stop watching. That clip became late-night lore, an uncomfortable masterpiece of improvisation, tension, and unfiltered reality. And as we'll see in the next moment, sometimes the guest isn't thrown off by jokes or tension. Sometimes they come in with something to prove. And Johnny Carson knows exactly how to turn that ambition into a slow, controlled unraveling. Coming up, what happens when a fragile star tries to act confident, and Carson sees right through them. The unflappable celebrity. Some guests came on The Tonight Show with nerves of steel, or at least that's what they wanted the audience to believe. But Carson had a rare ability to sense fear behind confidence, and when one particularly anxious celebrity sat down beside him, the unraveling began. The second Johnny cracked his first line, the guest was a rising star, known for their breakout performance in a recent drama. They were charming, photogenic, and doing the talk show circuit for the first time. From the moment they walked out, something was off. Hands fidgeted, eyes darted, a smile that looked like it was holding back a panic attack. Johnny picked up on it instantly, and instead of rescuing them with soft questions, he leaned in. "You doing all right?" he asked casually. The guest nodded too quickly. "You look like you just ran out of a courtroom," Johnny added with a smile. The audience laughed. The guest chuckled, nervously. But Johnny wasn't teasing. He was testing. What followed was a quiet, intense performance of psychological ping-pong. Carson would throw an easy question, then add a sharp tag. "Tell us about your latest role and how you managed to play someone calm." Another laugh, another stiff reply. And then Carson went still, letting the moment breathe. The silence itself became the punchline. The guest tried to steady themselves, told a story, forced a joke. But Johnny wasn't letting go. Without ever being cruel, he peeled back the layers of performance until all that was left was the real person. Scared, overwhelmed, and on the edge of cracking. And that's when Carson did something unexpected. He shifted tone completely. "You're doing fine," he said softly. "Trust me, the scariest part's over." It was a rare moment of warmth, delivered in front of millions. The audience applauded, not for a joke, but for the compassion hiding in Carson's armor. And just like that, the guests started to relax. Their posture softened. The answers came more naturally. Carson had pushed them to the brink, just to show them they'd survive. That episode became a masterclass in how to build someone up by first knocking down the mask. Critics called it one of Carson's most human moments. Years later, the guest would go on to win awards, headline movies, and even joke in interviews about, "That night, Johnny broke me in." But not every guest came with self-doubt. Some came in ready for war, especially when politics were involved. And that brings us to a night where Carson didn't just expose nerves, he exposed the truth behind the talking points. Political pressure cooker. There's something undeniably tense about seeing two political rivals share a single stage. Now imagine that stage is The Tonight Show, and the host sitting between them is Johnny Carson, armed with a dry smile and sharper questions than any journalist dared ask. The night started diplomatically. Two politicians, opposing parties, mutual disdain, sat side by side, shaking hands for the cameras. But the smiles were thin, the tension thick. Carson welcomed them both with charm, then leaned back in his chair like a man watching a fuse slowly burn. "Is it possible to disagree without lying?" he asked, innocently enough. One politician chuckled, the other cleared their throat, and then Carson added, "Because one of you said the other was lying last week, and here you both are smiling, so what gives?" The crowd loved it. The guests, not so much. One tried to spin, offering a polished answer about policy and interpretation. But Carson pressed again, not with volume, but with calm persistence. He read back a quote, asked if it was still true, waited. The second guest jumped in, contradicted the first, and just like that, the segment spiraled into open contradiction. For a moment, it was as if Johnny wasn't even there. The guests argued, defended, accused. And Carson? He sat with that iconic smirk, watching like a man who'd just dropped a match into a powder keg. When one guest snapped, "I don't think this is the forum for a debate," Carson replied without missing a beat. "That's strange. You've been debating for 5 minutes." The studio audience exploded with laughter. But behind the scenes, NBC censors were sweating. Carson had created a space where truth slipped out, not in anger, but in clarity. The guests had shown their real selves, and not everyone liked what they saw. When the show ended, the handshake was colder. The political fallout lasted for days. Commentators picked apart every word. Headlines ran with the sound bites. Carson exposes hypocrisy. Late night turns into truth night. It wasn't what the network planned, but it was exactly what the public needed. And Carson knew it. He never claimed to be political. He didn't take sides. He just asked the questions no one else dared. And in doing so, he made The Tonight Show more than entertainment. It became a crucible. Next up, we look at a moment where the guest flipped the script and Carson had to wrestle control back, live, with no safety net. Unexpected rebellion. There's a kind of guest every talk show host learns to manage, the safe one, polite, polished, practiced. They say all the right things, smile at the right moments, and don't rock the boat. But every once in a while, someone decides, mid-interview, to throw away the script. And on that night, Johnny Carson saw it happening in real time. The guest was a well-liked figure in entertainment, not controversial, not combative, just routine. That's how the segment started. Routine. Until Johnny asked a standard question about their latest project, and the guest suddenly paused. A long, awkward pause. Then, in a voice that was almost shaky, they said, "I'm tired of pretending this stuff matters." You could feel the room freeze. Carson didn't rush in. He let the silence hang. Then he said, "Well, that's not on the cue card." The audience laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. Everyone sensed it. This wasn't a joke anymore. The guest leaned forward, almost challenging Carson now. They started venting, not just about the industry, but about fame itself. Hollywood politics, fake friendships, tabloid lies. The camera operator didn't know where to look. Carson sat still, listening, then calmly leaned forward. "Is this what you came here to say? Or is this what you've been holding in for too long?" It was no longer an interview. It was an intervention. The guest looked stunned. For a second they seemed to pull back, like maybe they regretted opening the door. But Carson wouldn't let them close it. He kept asking questions, not aggressive ones, but precise. Focused. He took their rebellion and reframed it into reflection. By the end of the segment, the guest was quieter, exhausted, changed. The audience, unsure how to react, gave a strange mix of applause and silence. And when they left the stage, Johnny simply said, "Sometimes the mask slips, and sometimes that's the whole point." That moment became one of the show's most unexpected pivots. Not planned, not rehearsed. Just one person, tired of pretending, facing a man who could see right through them. The headlines the next day were mixed. Some called it a breakdown, others a breakthrough. But everyone agreed. It was real. And if you thought that was raw, the next moment dug even deeper. Because this time, Carson didn't wait for the truth to surface. He ripped off the gloss with a single remark and exposed a lie the guest thought they'd buried forever. Genja Dajielu, truth revealed. The guest walked onto the stage with charm, confidence, and a reputation that sparkled. Their image was flawless, beloved by the public, adored by critics, and wrapped in a carefully managed persona. But Carson had done his homework, and he'd noticed something. A detail, a contradiction, and he wasn't about to let it slide. The interview started smooth. The guest told a few stories, delivered some crowd pleasers. It was going well, until Carson tilted his head slightly and said, "Funny, that's not what you said in 1976. The smile vanished. The guest blinked. "Excuse me?" Carson repeated himself, slowly, calmly. "In '76, you said you'd never do television, that it was beneath serious actors, so what changed?" Boom! The audience fell into a hush. Carson wasn't smirking now. He was serious, direct, the kind of direct that didn't ask for permission. The guest tried to laugh it off, claiming they'd grown or evolved, but Carson wasn't done. He pulled out a quote, verbatim, cited the interview, held the silence like a blade. And then, the guest cracked. They stuttered, shifted in their seat, tried to change the subject, but Carson kept bringing it back. Not with cruelty, but with ironclad persistence. He wasn't trying to humiliate them. He was dismantling the illusion. Eventually, the guest gave in, admitted to having made arrogant choices in their early career, admitted the quote, admitted the contradiction. And for the first time, the audience applauded, not for the guest's fame, but for their honesty. Carson leaned back, smiled, and said, "Now that sounds like the real you." It was quiet, strangely powerful, because the show wasn't about scandal. It was about truth cutting through the performance. And Carson had just guided someone through that minefield without ever raising his voice. The newspapers had a field day. "Johnny strips down the star," one read. But fans saw it differently. To them, It was Carson doing what he did best, finding the person behind the persona. And that moment still stands as a reminder. No matter how polished the guest, Carson could always find the crack. And sometimes, letting the truth out was the most dramatic thing of all. But not every confrontation ended in clarity. Sometimes, Carson was left wondering, had the guest truly changed, or just gotten better at hiding? Up next, a story of redemption, regret, and a question that cuts straight through the comeback. Healed or humbled? Redemption stories are a dime a dozen in Hollywood. One scandal, a quiet few years, then a comeback tour that hits every talk show couch from coast to coast. But when a disgraced celebrity returned to The Tonight Show years after their fall from grace, Johnny Carson didn't offer them a free pass. He offered them a test. The guest had been a tabloid fixture, the kind of name people whispered about behind headlines and closed doors. Once a beloved figure, they had lost it all: career, reputation, dignity. And now, here they were, smiling carefully as they slid into Carson's guest chair like nothing ever happened. But Johnny remembered. He opened softly, light jokes, warm banter, but the edge was never far. Then came the moment. Johnny leaned in just slightly and asked, "When you look back, do you feel regret or relief?" The guest froze. It was the kind of question only Johnny Carson could ask with a smile, and still cut to the bone. The actor hesitated, then offered the safe answer. "I've changed. I've grown. We all make mistakes." Carson didn't blink. "Sure, but some mistakes take people with them." The audience didn't laugh. They listened. That's what separated Carson from every other host. He wasn't afraid of the pause. The guest tried again, opening up more this time. They talked about the years in hiding, the therapy, the self-reflection. But Johnny, ever the quiet psychologist, followed up with a whisper of steel. So why did it take losing everything to start telling the truth? That was the moment. Not anger, not defensiveness, just silence. And finally, the guest said, "Because I didn't know who I was until there was nothing left." There it was, real, unfiltered. For a moment, the past was in the room, visible in their eyes, their voice, their posture, and Carson nodded, as if to say, "That's what I wanted to hear." That night, the redemption arc wasn't wrapped in applause. It was wrapped in honesty. And fans didn't see a star rise again. They saw a person own their fall. That clip didn't go viral for the confession. It spread because Johnny made accountability cinematic. And as the lights dimmed and the segment wrapped, Carson offered one last line. Sometimes the second act is the real story. But sometimes there are no acts left, only the final line. Which brings us to the night Carson delivered a closing question so loaded, the guest couldn't hide, and the audience couldn't look away. Curtain call confrontation. You could tell from the moment they walked out, it was the final time. A farewell tour, a last stop, a closing chapter. The guest had aged. Slower walk, heavier smile, but the legacy still glowed around them. A cultural icon. And Johnny treated them with respect. But respect doesn't mean comfort. And Carson didn't believe in letting people leave without answering for the full story. The interview was nostalgic. Career highlights, funny stories, old clips. The audience soaked it up. And just when it seemed like the segment would end on a soft, sweet note, Johnny paused. He turned, looked the guest in the eye, and asked quietly, "If you could go back, Would you still become this version of yourself? No applause, no laughter, just the weight of a life boiled down to one impossible question. The guest smiled, but it was shaky. "I wouldn't change a thing," they replied. Johnny held the silence. "Not even the betrayals? The people you lost?" His voice was calm, but the guest's face changed. What followed was a rare kind of honesty. They admitted things they hadn't said in years. Regrets, choices they made for fame, people they left behind, and how, even with all the awards and applause, some things still haunted them. It wasn't a breakdown, it was a reckoning. Carson let them speak, didn't interrupt, just listened. And when they were finished, he offered a final, almost whispered line. "Then, maybe tonight, you finally made peace with the audience." The camera held for an extra beat. The guest looked down, nodded, and for the first time in the entire interview, they looked completely unguarded. Human. No music played. Just the quiet hum of the studio as the credits rolled. And in that silence, Johnny Carson did what no late-night host had ever done before. He turned the final goodbye into a confession booth. One question, one answer. A lifetime unwrapped under stage lights. That moment wasn't just the end of an episode, it was the end of a myth, right there on the couch. Because that's what Carson did. He didn't just talk to people, he stripped them down, built them up, and showed the world who they really were. Sometimes in laughter, sometimes in fire, but always in truth. Behind the laughter, the suits, and the stage lights, Carson exposed what others hid. These weren't just arguments. They were revelations. Some guests walked away humbled. Others never recovered. One host, one desk, and 20 unforgettable confrontations that changed late night forever. And that's why nobody ever played Johnny twice.